Nonetheless, you said you wanted a bit of an overview of what are labels and what you can do. So if you are creating like you are creating like a color palette and you wanted to create these shades, you can create and you can just add that as a style, or you can create a variable from that library. This one will be my 500 and now it's here. Then let's add another one and say that this will be my 600 and 800. So now we have technically variables from 5 to 8 for our color palettes. What that means is we have the ability to say, oh, now I have a rectangle and that rectangle is going to use my 700. So far, so good. Though at some point you decide to say, oh, you know what? 700 is going to be green. It changes everywhere. That's why you use variables. But technically you can do that with styles. So that's useless. The real use case of variable is when you do modes. And so from here, I have my mode number 1, and then I can have my mode number 2, and then I will do a third mode just in case for the sake of the argument. Going to be blue. And so now that I have these modes predefined, I can frame this. Let's have a fill of pure black so that we can see of these things. And from here, we can say I have my frame. It's going to use my variable collection with the mode number 1 in it. And in my frame number 2, instead of using mode number 1, it's going to use mode number 2. And my frame number 3, you guessed it, it's going to use mode number 3. But it's the same colors every time. So what that means is if I take these elements and I move them to my frame number 2, you can see how it just changed color because the frame settings are implying things. So that's for colors, like simple, basic colors definition. But in your variables, you can do way more than just color. I could have a number variable that has in mode number 1 a value of 8, in mode number 2 a value of 16, and in mode number 3 a value of 32, double every time. So what that means is if I have an element right here that has a height with my number 8 and then I move it to the other one, you can see how it grows based on the definition of the mode on the frame value. So let's just do that, right? This is still 8, my number value, but it's now 16, and then this one is my number value again, but it's 32. So that is a way to ensure that your elements will stay reasonable size based on the parent settings. So you trickle down some numbers, some colors, some definition of strings, numbers, boolean, whatever. So if I had like a boolean thing that says green for my string here, that says red for the string, and that says blue here, and then I just have a text that is going to take its content going to be taken from like a string value. I think I need a component out of it to be able to get that. My size right here. So now that component is taking its value from my initial string in my variables. If I take that component instance and I put it here, it then changed the content of my strings. And so you can do that with plenty of stuff. I could have my colors, use my 500. And so now it's just adding the right color to the right elements. And if you have this thing that is an auto layout frame and my values here are going to be my number value for my padding, it means that my element here is 90 or 89, but that here, because my padding is now 16, it's going to be 105, and here, because my padding is now 32, it's 137. So you can have the ability to change really quickly from your desktop design to your tablet design to your mobile design just by using variable numbers, font sizes, text values, colors, all of that without really thinking about it. And then you just have to swipe through like a component and just take the values automatically. So that is why we have created variables and how to use it. Once we have these, you also have the last one, which is the boolean number, which is true, false. And so it could be a very basic thing that says on green, it is true, on red, it is false, but on blue, it's true as well. And that could be from my element right here. Let's say I have this thing with a rectangle next to it. Now you can see they all have a rectangle. However, this thing is going to have the visibility boolean of the boolean that we have defined, meaning that on red it's not visible, but on blue and on green it is visible. So if you had a design of a header hero section for landing page, for example, and you define that the input field for the email is only visible on desktop and tablet, but not on mobile. When you just drag the component of your hero header, hero section to the mobile frame, resize everything and get the visibility also defined. So that is the idea. So that's my 3 things. I don't really know, and I haven't really deep dived into the prototype things. I really have a bit of an issue with the prototyping with variables. The main reason that I have an issue with this is because the instant at which you are doing all of that work to ensure that the variables that you are selecting are working with condition, with automation, with changes, you could have sent the thing to the dev and they would have done the thing already in code, working in production, just because of how easier it is for them to do that. And if you have knowledge of code, doing it in Figma is just like a waste of time. I never used it. That's why I'm like discovering it with you. I saw it, I clicked on it, I tried it to see how it worked, but I don't see the point. It doesn't work as it would work in code. If you have modes, going back to the viable thing, which is if you have themes, like themable elements, and you have different modes, which, as they say, the original use case for modes is to have light mode and dark mode, and that's about it, even though they give you the ability to get 40 modes if you pay for it, whatever. If you just do light and dark, but then in your prototype, you cannot switch from light to dark in the frame level mode, then what's the fucking point? There's no need. There is nothing that makes sense. So I don't know. Yeah, you should know about tokens, but variables and tokens are the same thing. They are not exactly the same things because they are named variables, but design tokens and design variables in Figma technically are behaving in a similar way. So you just have to know one or the other. I would highly recommend you to understand tokens rather than variables, unless you are willing or planning on learning code. If you are trying to learn code, learn variables as a main word. But other than that, design tokens, design variables are the same thing when it comes to Figma overall. So if you need to understand what it is and how it works, a design variable is a single element and it's composed of a single value of something. So it's going to be a string, so a string of characters, or a string of number, like a number variable, or a color variable, which contains like an X code, or the last one is a boolean variable, which is true or false. A design token is going to use or reuse a variable as a base. The role of the design token is to ensure that its readability is readable. Like right now, this color is called 500. That has no meaning to anyone that is not a designer or dev. If you don't know how color palettes are currently named based on material design, that goes in 500 in center, and then at the bottom to be the darkest one, and 100 at the top to be the lightest one, 500 means nothing. So in order to ensure that the people that are supposed to design things with your variables use them in the right position, you are then going to create a new variable in here saying this is going to be a color variable, and that color variable is going to be called my button background. And that button background is going to use my 500. And so here I'm going to do the same thing 3 times to ensure that my button background is going to be my 500. And then let's duplicate this thing. And I'm going to take that to say button background hover. Okay, I could do like a colon hover, makes more sense. It's going to use 600 on hover. And then I'm going to duplicate this again. And this is going to be pressed. Now I'm reusing my 700. So right now, let's say that this was like a button. I can then remove that color thing, make sure that this is white, and change my background here to use my button background as a base. And then if I have a secondary variation of that is called hover, I'm then going to use my button hover. And then if I have another one that is going to be active, I can then use my button active. I could have said 5, 6, 7, like 500, 600, 700 for the background. But for someone that doesn't know what it's talking about, the numbers, now they can just pick, oh, I'm building a thing called a button. So I'm using the variable called button bg. So at the instant at which you are renaming primitive variable, it becomes a design token. It's not a design variable, but it's the same thing. It's just, you can think of it as a design token is a renamed version of your variable in order to make it clearer for the people that are gonna design into your files. if you know that you will never share the file, you don't really give a shit about it. That's about it. And if I go on MomUI, if you go in here, and I figured I should have zoomed in a bit. I have my 0, which are my divs. And so I have a set of eyeballs for dark mode and light mode, like 2 modes, and that's it. No more, no less. From here, I have my tomato color, which is red, and has from 1 to 12. This is based on Radix UI. These are the values that I'm using for this. And then in my components, in my badges, for example, I will reuse my orange alpha 4, which is above viable, but the name of this thing is going to be badges/background. That kind of makes sense. So that's my primitive things, but then I have a ton of other things like the accent color, the communication colors, the icons. That's basically it. The usefulness of these things is now when I'm using the buttons, they are using my button primary content, my button primary border, and my button primary default background as variables. And so that way, if I go into my initial color, because these variables are reusing primitive variables, if I change my primitive, it changes across the entire thing. If I go into my button component, you can see that my primary button is using my accent 9 as a base background. If I were to say, you know what, today you're going to use my whatever 9, you can see it changed the entire thing in a click. And that's because it's using an abstraction of the initial primitive thing. So now I can also say, oh, you know what? My accent 9 right here is going to use this one. And now it rounds up with every element that are using the accent 9 value. And it just changed to orange. So now I have buttons that are orange instead of being green. So I just have to go in one place to update the thing. That's the idea. You can say, technically, it makes no difference if I had used styles like basic styles with my 100, 500, whatever, and then change my base style, it would have been the same. So that's one thing. The second thing is you can use labels inside of your styles. So one of the usefulness of styles today is the fact that if I had this element being from one of my accent, whatever, it could have on top of it a gradient of pure white to pure white transparent, and that thing is going to be 100%. And so that way you get like a gradient of your initial colors, and that entire thing can become a new style because it's composed of multiple elements. And so now if I know that I will always have this used, that would be fine. It would be a style. But from there, with my communication color, my accent color being like communication, gray, violet, it always will have the ability to then switch the background and keep that white gradient on top. So your style can be more powerful with multiple layers of things, but that's about it. That's basically it for variable. Once again, I know that you can go do things crazy with the variable in prototypes, and I know it's good. To me, it's a bit of a waste. I just like this though. To me, this is one of the best thing that variable modes are bringing. The ability for me to just say, okay, we have light mode, dark mode, cool, that's good. And then now this frame is defined in light, cool, no issues. However, it's currently using my green accent color, and I know that Stony, for example, would prefer the violet accent color. I can just do that, and now I have my violet accent color. Because I haven't updated this file in a while, the shadows are still wrong, but technically speaking, nowadays we have the ability to say, oh, you know what, this thing, it's currently using the accent color 9 at 100%, and why not just use your accent color like 8 or 9 as a default? And so now I have the ability to just change my base shadow, and it will always be good, and the shadows will follow through, which is what I need to do. Let me change these to ensure that we have our accent 9 for each of these. You can see how it changes right there because I set that to accent purple. Can I do that? Yeah, I can do that. Cool. And so now we're good. This thing has been updated. So now it means that if I have my variable initial to be set to communication, which is red, my shadow and focus ring are also selected with the right color.